Tonight we begin with a loaf of bread that was baked roughly 3,000 years before your grandparents were born. A dense, chewy, gritty little thing that would have snapped a modern dental crown clean off and didn't particularly care about your feelings. The ancient Egyptians ate it anyway, every single day, because it was the foundation of everything. Their diet, their economy, their spiritual life, and in many ways, their very identity as a civilization. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. We are always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've got personal experience with bread baking, old family recipes, or you remember a time when food was made rather differently than it is today, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is a reason the ancient Egyptians called bread tar, a word so fundamental, so embedded in daily life, that it also meant simply food. Not a particular kind of food, not a fancy food, just food, the thing itself. If you had bread, you had everything. If you didn't, the situation was, to put it diplomatically, suboptimal. For a civilization that lasted more than 3,000 years along one of the world's great rivers, the Egyptians organized enormous portions of their economy, their labor systems, and their spiritual understanding of the universe around the growing, processing, and eating of grain. Tonight we're going to explore what they actually ate. All of it, from the coarse flatbread of the field worker to the roasted goose at the pharaoh's table. And in doing so, we're going to discover that the people of ancient Egypt were more sophisticated, more creative, and frankly more interesting in their relationship with food than most of us were ever taught. We tend to imagine ancient peoples eating rather grimly, gnawing on things, squinting at questionable ingredients in poorly lit spaces. And while it's true that life in ancient Egypt had its challenges, more on those in a moment, the picture that emerges from archaeology, from tomb paintings, from papyrus records, and from the analysis of actual preserved food found in tombs and settlement sites, is one of a culture that genuinely cared about what it ate, that developed flavors, that prized variety, that understood in a practical and deeply felt way the connection between what you put in your body and how you lived your life. They weren't eating badly. By the standards of the ancient world, many of them were eating rather well. Much of what we know about Egyptian food comes from an unlikely combination of sources. The most vivid are the tomb paintings, those extraordinary windows into daily life that the Egyptians painted on the walls of burial chambers, believing that the depicted abundance would carry forward into the afterlife. These paintings are detailed, with an almost obsessive precision. You can count the individual loaves stacked on offering tables, identify the species of fish being carried by servants, distinguish the type of goose being prepared for roasting. The ancient Egyptians were, in a sense, the world's first food documentarians. They recorded meals not as art for art's sake, but as religious necessity. And in doing so, they left us an extraordinarily complete visual record of what they ate, how they prepared it, and who ate what. Beyond the paintings, archaeologists have found actual food, preserved by Egypt's famously dry climate in ways that still astonish researchers. Sealed storage jars containing grain identified as emmer wheat and barley, dried figs and dates still holding their shape, dried meat, honey that 3,000 years later was still technically edible if you were feeling adventurous, animal bones with butchery marks that tell us how creatures were processed, charred seeds from cooking fires that reveal what vegetables were grown in which periods. The ancient Egyptians, quite unintentionally, left us one of the most complete food archives in the ancient world. And the story that archive tells is fascinating. Section 1. The Staff of Life. Bread in Ancient Egypt. Let us begin, as the Egyptians themselves would have, with bread. If there is a single food that defines Egyptian civilization more completely than any other, it is bread. And not merely because they ate a great deal of it, though they did. Bread in ancient Egypt was currency, salary, religious offering, and daily sustenance all at once. Workers were paid in bread. The gods were given bread. The dead were provisioned with bread. Children grew up on bread. And the Egyptians, to their considerable credit, didn't just make one kind. Archaeologists studying bread remains from ancient sites across Egypt have identified more than 40 distinct varieties. 40 types of bread in a civilization that, from our modern vantage point, might seem to have had limited ingredients to work with. The primary grain was emmer wheat, not the soft, high-gluten wheat you'd recognize from a modern bakery, but a hardy, ancient variety with a tough outer hull that needed vigorous processing before it could be ground into flour. Barley was also widely grown and consumed, particularly in the form of beer, which we will get to shortly. The grain harvest was the central event of the Egyptian agricultural year, celebrated with festivals, recorded meticulously in administrative papyri, and protected by law with a ferocity that would have impressed even the most zealous modern agricultural regulator. The process of turning grain into bread was, by our standards, extraordinarily labor-intensive, and by the standards of the time, it was largely women's work. Grinding grain was performed by hand on a stone saddle quern, a large, flat, lower stone and a smaller upper stone that you pushed back and forth across the grain. It was back-breaking work performed while kneeling, and physical evidence from ancient Egyptian skeletons tells a stark story. Many women's skeletons from this period show significant arthritis in the knees and lower back, compression damage in the lower vertebrae, and characteristic wear patterns in the toe bones from the particular position required to kneel and grind. You can read the daily work of bread-making written directly into the bones of the people who did it. That is, in its own quiet way, one of the more humbling things that archaeology ever reveals. The flour that resulted from this grinding was rarely fine by our standards. Despite their best efforts at sifting, using woven baskets to separate out the coarser material, Egyptian bread flour consistently contained sand and grit from the grinding stones, tiny particles of stone that wore away during processing, and the occasional fragment of debris that made it through the winnowing process. Dental analysis of ancient Egyptian remains confirms this in exactly the way you'd expect. Enormous amounts of dental wear, ground down tooth surfaces, and tooth fractures consistent with a lifetime of eating gritty bread. Not exactly the stuff of a modern dental advertisement. If you'd like to feel better about your annual cleaning, the ancient Egyptians provide excellent perspective. The dough itself was mixed by hand or, in larger operations, kneaded with the feet, a practice that tomb paintings depict without apparent embarrassment, and which, in the context of large-scale bread production for temples or palace kitchens, was simply practical. Workers would step and press through enormous quantities of dough, using their body weight to achieve the kind of thorough mixing that hand kneading alone couldn't accomplish for industrial-scale production. The Egyptians were, by any measure, extremely pragmatic people. Leavening is a fascinating question. We know that the Egyptians used fermentation in bread making, that is, they understood in a practical, if not chemically precise way, that leaving dough to rest allowed it to rise, and that risen bread was different from flat bread in texture and flavor. How did they achieve this? Likely through wild yeast that lived naturally in the air and in their flour stores, and possibly through the deliberate saving of a portion of the previous day's dough as a starter. Essentially what we'd recognize today as a sourdough culture. Interestingly, the same wild yeast strains responsible for the fermentation of Egyptian bread were also responsible for the fermentation of Egyptian beer, and there is genuine scholarly debate about which came first in the great yeast utilization project of human civilization. The bread people and the beer people reliably cannot agree. The beer people, it should be noted, are louder about their position. The baking itself was done in several ways, depending on who you were and what resources you had access to. The simplest method, used by field workers and the very poor, involved placing a flat round of dough directly on the coals of a fire or pressing it against the hot exterior of a clay oven. This produced something close to a flat bread, thin, dense, scorched on the outside, chewy within. Perfectly edible, unremarkable. Not something you'd center a dinner party around, but food in the truest and most direct sense of the word. For those with slightly more resources, the middle classes of Egyptian society, skilled artisans, administrators, priests, the preferred vessel was the bedja, a tall, conical clay mold, roughly the shape of a very elongated flower pot, that was heated in the fire until it was nearly too hot to approach, then smeared with oil and loaded with dough. The mold retained heat and distributed it evenly, producing a bread with a firm crust, a softer interior, and that distinctive tall conical shape you see stacked in such quantities in Egyptian tomb art. These molds have been found in enormous numbers at archaeological sites across Egypt, including at the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, which, as we'll discover later, tells us a great deal about the quality of life available to at least some ancient Egyptian workers. The varieties of bread extended well beyond the simple divisions of flat and conical. Tomb paintings and administrative records describe breads flavored with honey, with dates, with coriander seeds, with sesame. There were sweet breads and savory breads, dense loaves and lighter ones, breads made specifically for religious offerings, and breads made specifically for field workers' rations. Some breads were baked with a mixture of different grains. Some were enriched with fat, animal fat or vegetable oil, to produce a softer, more tender product. There were even what appear to be bread-like pastries, enriched with generous quantities of dates or figs and honey that were made specifically for festivals and elite households. The Egyptians, to their considerable credit, understood that bread did not have to be a punishment. Those of you who remember your grandmother's kitchen, the smell of something just out of the oven, the weight of a good loaf, the resistance of a proper crust, will understand something that the Egyptians understood intuitively. That bread is not just fuel. It is comfort. It is home. It is the most fundamental form of abundance a household can have. For the ancient Egyptians, the ability to place bread on the table was both practical necessity and profound expression of what it meant to live well. When they painted the afterlife, they painted it full of bread. Section 2. Liquid bread. Beer as the foundation of daily life. If bread was the foundation of Egyptian life, beer was the liquid that held it together. And when we say beer, we should be careful to clarify. Egyptian beer was not quite what you'd pour at a backyard gathering. It was thick, nutritious, lightly alcoholic by modern standards, somewhere between a beverage and a meal, and it was consumed by virtually every level of Egyptian society, every day, from childhood to old age. Children drank it, priests drank it, pharaohs drank it, workers were paid in it, the gods received it as offerings. In a land where the water of the Nile could carry any number of waterborne illnesses, a mildly fermented beverage with antimicrobial properties was not a luxury. It was, quite practically, the safer option. The Egyptian word for beer was henket, and its production was intimately related to the production of bread. So much so that some scholars have suggested the two crafts were essentially variations on the same process, carried out by the same people in the same facilities. The basic method, as best as we can reconstruct it from archaeological evidence, papyrus records, and, remarkably, from still active yeast cultures, recovered from ancient Egyptian vessels and successfully used by modern brewers to recreate the original product, went something like this. You began with partially baked bread, which was then broken apart and mixed with water, perhaps with the addition of raw grain, and allowed to ferment in sealed clay vessels. The result was a cloudy, moderately thick liquid with a relatively low alcohol content. Estimates range from roughly 2 to 3%, perhaps up to 5% in stronger varieties made for elite consumption. A light caramel malt flavor, a noticeable sourness from the lactic acid fermentation, and a nutritional profile that was, by ancient standards, quite impressive. Egyptian beer contained proteins, B vitamins, minerals, and calories, all things that a laboring population needed in quantity. It was, in other words, food that happened to be drinkable. Calling it liquid bread is not just a metaphor. It was essentially that. The thickness of Egyptian beer is an important point that often surprises modern readers. This was not a clear beverage. It was more like a porridge you drank through a long reed straw inserted from the top of the container, allowing the drinker to draw the liquid up from below the floating sediment. This explains one of the most characteristic images of Egyptian beer consumption in tomb art. Figures seated or kneeling, long reed straws extending into tall jars, their posture that of someone doing something that takes a moment of deliberate patience, because it did. You were drinking through a filter, essentially. The straw served a practical purpose. You might think of it as the ancient world's first beverage engineering problem, and the Egyptians solved it with a piece of hollow grass. Beer was so central to Egyptian life that the gods themselves were associated with it. Tenenet was the goddess specifically of beer and of childbirth. An interesting pairing that tells you something about what the Egyptians considered foundational to human experience. Osiris was, among his many responsibilities, credited by some traditions as the deity who had introduced grain cultivation to humanity, making him indirectly responsible for both bread and beer. The goddess Hathor, associated with fertility, music, and pleasure, had a festival called the Feast of Drunkenness, which involved the ritual consumption of large quantities of beer in a ceremony that commemorated a mythological event in which the goddess was given beer to prevent her from destroying humanity in a divine fit of anger. The beer, mixed with red ochre to resemble another more alarming substance, was spread across a field. Hathor drank it, became intoxicated, and humanity survived. Whether this qualifies as a good precedent for conflict resolution is perhaps a matter of perspective, but it does confirm that the Egyptians took their beer seriously enough to write it into their religious cosmology. For ordinary people, beer was allocated as part of standard daily rations for workers. Papyri from the New Kingdom recording rations at Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the artisans building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, show workers receiving 2 jugs of beer per day as part of their compensation. 2 jugs, every day, along with bread, vegetables, and periodic allocations of meat and fish. This was the standard package. The workers who cut and painted the most famous tombs in human history were, by the standards of their time, reasonably well provisioned, and their daily beer was a considered and deliberate part of that provision, not an informal perk. The scale of beer production required to sustain an ancient Egyptian workforce was staggering by any measure. At Giza, the site of the Great Pyramids, archaeologist Mark Lehner excavated a large workers' settlement in the 1980s and 90s that revealed what amounts to an industrial food production facility. The bakeries at this site had the capacity to produce between 1,000 and 2,000 loaves per day, and the associated brewery could produce between 35 and 50,000 liters of beer per month. For one workers' camp. The number of containers, the quantity of grain, the labor required to produce this, all of it points to a highly organized, well-resourced logistical operation. The pyramids were not built by desperate, poorly fed laborers operating on the ragged edge of survival. The archaeological evidence points toward well-organized, regularly provisioned, state-supported workers who received planned rations calibrated to the demands of their labor. 2 jugs of beer a day was apparently what it cost to move 2.5-ton stone blocks across the desert. By most assessments, this seems reasonable. The varieties of Egyptian beer, like the varieties of Egyptian bread, extended beyond what we might naively assume for an ancient culture. Administrative records describe multiple grades and types. Thin beer for daily worker rations, stronger, richer varieties for feasts and religious offerings, sweet beer brewed with dates or other fruits that appears to have been considered a luxury, and dark beer produced from more heavily roasted grain that would have had a distinctly different flavor profile. There is even reference in some texts to what appears to be a very strong, very thick variety used in specific religious ceremonies, something closer to a concentrate than a beverage, consumed in small quantities for ritual purposes rather than simple refreshment. Those of you who've ever brewed anything at home, whether beer, wine, vinegar, even sourdough bread, which runs on the same basic biological principles, will recognize the practical logic here. Fermentation is not a complicated process once you understand the basic conditions it requires: food for the organisms, warmth, time, and a reasonably clean vessel. The Egyptians had all of these in abundance. What they developed over 3,000 years of practice was an accumulated institutional knowledge, passed down through families, through temple brewing operations, through the administrative records of royal households, about how to control and refine that basic process, how to make it consistent, how to scale it, how to adjust it for different purposes. Modern brewers with chemistry degrees and precision thermometers work within the same fundamental constraints that Egyptian brewers navigated by instinct and experience. The equipment changed, the principles didn't. Those of you who remember when food was made rather than bought, who helped press grapes or bake bread, or watched a parent or grandparent do something in the kitchen that took days rather than hours, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. What's the oldest food or drink tradition in your family? Drop it below. I'm always curious. Section 3. The Garden and the Field. Vegetables, legumes, and the green world. Bread and beer kept ancient Egyptians alive, but vegetables kept them healthy. And the Egyptians, who were excellent practical observers of cause and effect, even without the benefit of modern nutritional science, seem to have understood this intuitively. The agricultural land of the Nile Valley, enriched annually by flood-deposited silt that was, mile for mile, among the most productive soil on the surface of the ancient earth, produced vegetables in quantity and variety that would have been the envy of most ancient civilizations. The garden was not a luxury. It was a standard feature of Egyptian domestic life, scaled to whatever land and water access a household could manage, and cultivated with a thoroughness that archaeological remains consistently confirm. The king of Egyptian vegetables, by almost any measure, was the onion. Onions appear in Egyptian records with a frequency that suggests they were consumed at nearly every level of society, in nearly every context, at almost every meal. They were offered to the gods. They were placed in tombs to provision the dead. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded an inscription on the Great Pyramid, which he may have been misled about, but that's Herodotus for you, claiming that workers who built it consumed enormous quantities of radishes, onions, and garlic. The numbers he cited were almost certainly exaggerated. The basic observation that pyramid workers ate a great deal of onions is almost certainly correct. Actual onion remains have been found in numerous Egyptian archaeological contexts, including tucked into the wrappings of mummies, apparently to provision the deceased, or possibly for ritual reasons involving the onion's layered structure as a symbol of the nested circles of the universe, depending on which scholar you ask. Garlic was consumed with similar enthusiasm, and for reasons that weren't purely culinary. Egyptian medical papyri, and several survive, including the remarkable Ebers Papyrus, a medical compendium dating to around 1550 before the Common Era, prescribe garlic for everything from intestinal parasites to cardiovascular problems to simple fatigue. The Egyptians were, by ancient standards, rather medically sophisticated, and their use of garlic as a therapeutic agent has attracted genuine modern research interest. Whether their specific applications were always sound is debatable. That garlic has real physiological effects is not. Leaks appeared regularly in both written records and in the physical remains of settlements. Cucumbers, which thrived in the warm Egyptian climate, are mentioned in enough contexts that we can be confident they were widely eaten and widely enjoyed. Lettuce, a variety different from what you'd find on a modern plate, a tall, romaine-like plant called Lactuca sativa that grew quite vigorously, had a particular religious significance in addition to its everyday culinary role. Lettuce was sacred to the god Min, associated with fertility, because when the plant is cut, it releases a white, milky sap. The Egyptians, who had a gift for finding natural phenomena that reminded them of other things, incorporated this observation into their religious iconography with characteristic directness. We can simply note that lettuce was important, eaten frequently, and leave it there. Legumes deserve particular attention because they were, in terms of nutrition, doing a great deal of heavy lifting in the Egyptian diet. Lentils were a staple found in numerous archaeological contexts and mentioned frequently in administrative records. They were easy to store, high in protein, and could be cooked simply, boiled in water, seasoned, and eaten alongside bread, or incorporated into more complex preparations. Fava beans, which the Egyptians called fool, and which are still called fool and still eaten in Egypt today, particularly in the beloved breakfast dish, full medames, were similarly widespread and similarly important. The continuity here is worth pausing on for a moment. The same bean that Egyptian farmers grew beside the Nile 4,000 years ago is the same bean that is soaked overnight in millions of Egyptian and Middle Eastern households today to be cooked slowly in the morning and served with olive oil, lemon, and cumin. 4,000 years, and the recipe is functionally unchanged. Food is, in some ways, the most persistent form of human culture. Chickpeas appeared somewhat less frequently in the archaeological record than lentils and fava beans, but were certainly present. Peas are documented. A variety of what appear to be different vetch and bean species show up in storage vessel remains and in the seed deposits associated with cooking sites. The picture that emerges from this legume evidence is of a population that, while it may not have had access to meat at every meal, and most Egyptians, as we'll discuss, did not, was not nutritionally deficient in the way we might assume. A diet built on bread, beer, lentils, fava beans, onions, garlic, and seasonal vegetables is a diet that, in broad nutritional terms, works fairly well. Not glamorous, perhaps, but functional, sustaining, and in the hands of skilled cooks, of whom ancient Egypt had many, capable of producing food that was genuinely good. The cooking methods available to ordinary Egyptian households were relatively simple by design, but that simplicity was a feature of their practicality rather than a reflection of culinary disinterest. The basic equipment was a clay brazier or a small clay oven, a set of cooking pots in graduated sizes, a grinding stone for grain and seeds, wooden spoons and paddles, and an assortment of clay storage vessels. With this equipment, an experienced Egyptian cook could boil, simmer, roast, fry, using oil, and bake. That covers most of the fundamental cooking techniques available to any cuisine. The constraints were not in method, but in fuel. Wood was not particularly abundant in Egypt, and the conservation of cooking fuel was a real practical concern. Long, slow simmering over low coals was more economical than high-heat cooking. This, perhaps, is why Egyptian cuisine, to the extent we can reconstruct it, appears to have favored stews, porridges, and slow-cooked preparations over quick, high-heat methods. Slow food, in the most literal possible sense. Herbs and aromatics deserve their own moment of attention, because the evidence suggests that Egyptian cooks were not indifferent to flavor. Coriander seeds, which have a warm, citrusy, slightly woody flavor when dried, were found in such quantities at various sites that they appear to have been an everyday seasoning rather than an occasional luxury. Cumin, which is earthy, warm, and slightly bitter, appears in both culinary and medical contexts. Fenugreek, with its distinctive bitter maple-like flavor, was used in bread and as a flavoring agent. Dill and thyme and other aromatic herbs were cultivated in kitchen gardens. Mustard seeds have been identified in food remains. The picture, in other words, is of a cuisine that actively sought out and applied flavor. A cuisine that understood contrast and seasoning, that developed preferences and traditions around specific combinations. It was not a bland diet. It was a seasoned one. Salt deserves a mention here, because it is easy to take for granted, and the Egyptians absolutely did not. Salt was obtained primarily from the natron deposits in the Western Desert, particularly from Wadi Natrun, which remains a source of natron today, and from evaporated sea and lake water. It served multiple functions: as a seasoning, as a food preservative of enormous practical importance, and as a ritual purifying agent. Natron, which is a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, was used in the mummification process, giving it a uniquely Egyptian cultural weight. But ordinary table salt was also known and used in cooking and food preservation from very early periods. Fish preservation, which we'll discuss in detail shortly, depended heavily on salt. Meat preservation depended on salt. The ability to extend the life of perishable food by salting it was not a trivial achievement. It was a fundamental technology of food security. Olive oil was less central to Egyptian cooking than it was to Mediterranean cuisines immediately to the north and east, partly because olive trees, while cultivated in Egypt from at least the New Kingdom period, never grew as abundantly in the Nile Valley climate as they did around the Mediterranean coast. The more commonly used cooking and seasoning fat in Egypt was oil pressed from the seeds of the moringa tree, which grew readily in the Egyptian climate and produced a mild, stable oil that kept well in the heat. Sesame oil was also used. Castor oil was apparently used in cooking in earlier periods, though its powerful laxative properties may eventually have persuaded cooks to seek alternatives. This is speculation, but it seems like a reasonable conclusion. Section 4. The sweetness of the valley. Fruit, honey, and the Egyptian appetite for sweet things. If bread and beer represented the practical core of Egyptian nutrition, fruit represented something closer to pleasure, and the Egyptians, refreshingly, had no philosophical objection to pleasure. The date palm was, after the grain crops, probably the single most important food plant in ancient Egypt, and for good reason. A single mature date palm can produce up to 170 kilograms of fruit per year, requires minimal water once established, thrives in the hot, dry conditions of the Nile Valley, and produces a fruit that is extraordinarily energy-dense, naturally preserved by its own sugar content, and sweet in a way that must have seemed almost luxurious against a dietary backdrop dominated by bread and lentils. Dates were eaten fresh, eaten dried, pressed into a thick syrup used as a sweetener, fermented into a date wine that was distinctly different from grape wine in flavor and character, and incorporated into bread preparations as both flavoring and sweetener. They were, in short, a versatile and beloved food that the Egyptians used with great creative enthusiasm. Fig trees grew abundantly along the Nile and were cultivated in household gardens and on estates. Both the common fig and the sycamore fig, a larger, less flavorful variety, are well documented in Egyptian records and physical remains. Figs appear in tomb paintings, in offering lists, and in the preserved food caches found in burial contexts with striking regularity. They were eaten fresh in season, dried for storage, and used in sweetened preparations. A fig, eaten fresh off a tree in hot weather, is a specific kind of pleasure. Soft, sweet, slightly musky, cool on the inside despite the heat. And the Egyptians appear to have been genuinely fond of them. Several medical papyri use figs in recipes not only for their medicinal properties but in ways that suggest familiarity with their flavor qualities. Figs, in other words, were not just medicine. They were good. Grapes and wine occupy a distinctive place in the Egyptian food story because they represent one of the clearest dividing lines between elite and ordinary Egyptian consumption. Grape cultivation in Egypt was not impossible. It was practiced in certain delta regions, in oasis settlements, and in the gardens of wealthy estates. But it was technically demanding, water-intensive, and geographically limited compared to the great wine-producing regions of the ancient Levant. As a result, wine in ancient Egypt was largely a product of the elite. It was served at royal feasts and aristocratic banquets. It was given as tribute and received as a gift between royal courts. It was offered to the gods in temple rituals of considerable importance. But it was not, for most Egyptians, an everyday beverage in the way that beer was. Wine was the drink of those who could afford it, which was not most people, which is perhaps why descriptions of wine in Egyptian texts carry a note of reverence that descriptions of beer, which everyone drank, simply don't. The wine jars of ancient Egypt, large ceramic amphorae sealed with clay stoppers, are among the most informative archaeological artifacts we have because the Egyptians had the useful habit of writing on them. A sealed wine jar might carry a label indicating the vintage year, the vineyard or estate of origin, the grape variety, the quality grade, and the name of the chief vintner responsible. The Egyptians were, in other words, doing something recognizable as wine labeling roughly 3,000 years before it became standard practice in Europe. Whether this reflects a sophisticated appreciation of wine variation or simply the administrative precision of a bureaucratic culture that labeled everything is an open question, probably both. The Egyptians were thorough people. Honey requires its own extended appreciation because in the ancient Egyptian context it was not merely a sweetener, it was medicine. It was ritual material. It was a product of significant economic value. And it was, perhaps most importantly, the only concentrated sweetener available in quantity before the spread of sugarcane cultivation centuries later. The Egyptians were among the earliest systematic beekeepers in the world. Tomb paintings from as early as around 2500 before the Common Era depict the management of clay cylinder hives, the harvesting of comb, and the processing and storage of honey with a technical specificity that suggests well-established practice. These paintings aren't showing something new or experimental. They're documenting a technology that had already been refined over generations. Egyptian beehives were horizontal clay cylinders stacked in rows that tomb paintings show arranged in racks or shelves, something very close in basic design to traditional beekeeping practices that survive in parts of North Africa today. The beekeeper's craft was respected enough that it had its own professional class, men called BJTJ, or beekeepers, who managed hives on behalf of temples, royal estates, and wealthy households. The honey they produced was stratified by quality and origin. Different floral sources produced different honey types, and the Egyptians characteristically tracked this. Medical papyri specify honey from particular sources for particular applications. The Ebers papyrus references honey in hundreds of remedies, from wound treatment where modern research confirms genuine antimicrobial efficacy, to digestive preparations to skin salves. The Egyptians were not wrong about honey's medical value. They couldn't have explained why it worked, but they observed that it did, and they used it accordingly. Pomegranates were introduced to Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, or Early New Kingdom, brought from the Levant along the trade networks that connected Egypt to the wider Near Eastern world, and were rapidly adopted with considerable enthusiasm. They appear in tomb paintings, in garden inventories of elite estates, and in medical texts within a relatively short time of their introduction. This tells us something about Egyptian cultural receptivity. When a new food was genuinely appealing and practical to grow in the Egyptian climate, it was absorbed and normalized remarkably quickly. The Egyptians were not conservative in their appetites. They were curious, practical people who adopted useful things when they encountered them. Watermelons, which originated in Africa, were grown in Egypt from very early periods and are among the more poignant food finds from Egyptian archaeological contexts. Seeds and rind fragments of what appears to be an early ancestor of the modern watermelon have been identified at sites across the Nile Valley. The fruit in its ancient form was likely less sweet than the varieties we know today. Thousands of years of selective cultivation have dramatically increased the sugar content of the modern watermelon. But in the Egyptian summer heat, a cool, water-rich melon must have been something that required very little additional recommendation. The carob tree produced long, dark pods, filled with a sweet, slightly chocolatey pulp and hard seeds that had a remarkably consistent weight. So consistent, in fact, that carob seeds were used as a unit of weight in ancient measurement systems, a practice that persisted through the medieval period and is, in attenuated form, where we get the modern gem-weight term, carat. The carob pod itself was eaten, pressed into a sweet syrup, and used as a flavoring agent. It was also, like honey, used in medical preparations. The Egyptians, like many ancient peoples, made little meaningful distinction between food and medicine in the way we might. A healthy diet and a therapeutic diet overlapped substantially, because the plants they ate were often the same plants their physicians prescribed. This is less mystical than it sounds. Many plant compounds that we now identify pharmacologically as therapeutically active were identified empirically by ancient peoples through centuries of observation. They didn't know why chamomile was calming or garlic was antimicrobial. They knew that it was. The distinction between knowing and understanding is one the ancient Egyptians navigated with more grace than we sometimes credit them. Section 5. The River's Bounty. Fish in the Egyptian diet. The Nile is one of the world's great rivers, and for most of its 3,000-mile length, it is a river of extraordinary biological productivity. In the ancient period, before the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, radically altered its ecology. Those of you who remember the debates around that project will appreciate the long view here. The Nile supported fish populations of a scale and variety that are difficult to imagine today. Tilapia, catfish, mullet, perch, eel, and dozens of other species moved through the river in quantities that made fishing not a marginal activity, but a significant industry. For ordinary Egyptians living along the Nile, which was most Egyptians, given that the country was effectively a narrow ribbon of habitable land on either side of the river, with desert extending immediately beyond, fish was among the most available and most consumed animal proteins in the diet. Fishing methods were diverse and well developed. Cast nets of woven linen cord, of the kind still used on the Nile by traditional fishermen today, were thrown from papyrus boats or from the riverbank. Trap nets were set across channels. Fish traps, woven basket structures with a funnel entrance that allowed fish in but made it difficult for them to exit, were submerged in shallower waters and checked regularly. Line fishing with hook and line is documented. Spear fishing from boats or the riverbank appears in tomb paintings and was apparently a pastime of sufficient appeal that elite Egyptians, including in painted depictions, royal figures, are shown doing it as leisure activity alongside hunting, standing in a papyrus skiff, holding a spear or throwing stick, pursuing fish and waterfowl in the reed marshes. This was, for the Egyptian aristocracy, approximately the equivalent of a pleasant weekend. Fish preservation was among the most practically important food technologies in ancient Egypt, and the Egyptians were expert practitioners of it. The basic methods were drying and salting, the same fundamental approaches that preserved fish in cultures around the world from ancient times well into the modern industrial era. Salted, dried fish could be stored for months, transported across distances, and provided protein in the lean seasons when fresh fish was less available. For a civilization that needed to feed large, organized workforces, the builders of temples and tombs and pyramids and irrigation networks, the ability to store and transport preserved food was not a convenience but an operational necessity. Archaeological evidence for fish processing and preservation in ancient Egypt is extensive. At many settlement sites, fish bones appear in enormous quantities, not the bones of the whole fish, which would suggest the fish was cooked and eaten on the spot, but often fragmented in ways consistent with processing. Evidence for salt storage in proximity to fish processing areas has been found. The physical infrastructure of large drying operations, the post holes of drying rack structures, large open areas apparently used for salted fish, has been identified at some sites. Large administrative documents record fish in quantities that only make sense if preserved product was being stored and distributed, not simply fresh fish being eaten. The tilapia holds a special place in Egyptian food culture that goes beyond nutrition. It was one of the most commonly eaten fish in ordinary Egyptian households, affordable, abundant, well-suited to the flavors of simple Egyptian seasoning. And it also carried strong symbolic associations. In Egyptian religious thought, the tilapia was associated with rebirth and with the sun's daily resurrection. In certain traditions, the tilapia was said to swim before the solar bark of Ra, guiding or heralding the sun's journey. The fish's habit of carrying its eggs and young in its mouth, a form of mouth brooding that protects the developing young, was interpreted as a symbol of emergence and renewal. An Egyptian sitting down to eat a tilapia for dinner was, in a sense, eating a symbol of the cosmos. Whether this made it taste better is not recorded. What is recorded, in enough detail to be genuinely revealing, is the fact that certain fish species were considered sacred or restricted in particular districts of Egypt, creating a complex religious geography of food taboo that varied by location. The oxyrhynchus fish, which was venerated in the city of the same name, could not be eaten there, though it was perfectly acceptable food in other parts of the country. The tilapia was restricted in some contexts. The eel had associations with the god Atum in certain traditions that rendered it problematic in some ritual contexts. The Greeks, always fascinated by and somewhat condescending about Egyptian religious customs, made frequent note of this patchwork system of local fish taboos, which struck them as both excessive and incomprehensible. The Egyptians, who had been managing this system for centuries, presumably found the Greeks' confusion mildly amusing. Those of you who grew up near water, whether it was a river, a lake, or the coast, and remember fishing as part of how your family actually fed itself, or just remember the particular smell of a good fish fry on a summer evening, drop a note in the comments. There's something remarkable about the continuity of that experience across so much time. The people we're talking about tonight weren't so different in that way. Section 6. Feathers and Flesh. Poultry and the birds of the Nile. The Nile Delta marshes in the ancient period were, by all accounts, among the most productive waterfowl habitats on Earth. During migration seasons, the skies above the delta filled with birds in numbers that modern observers, accustomed to a significantly depleted natural world, can barely imagine. Ducks of dozens of species, geese, herons, cranes, ibis, quail during their exhausted autumn migrations across the Mediterranean, pelicans, cormorants. The marshes were, in the most practical sense, a vast renewable food resource that the Egyptians exploited with considerable ingenuity and almost no guilt whatsoever. Hunting waterfowl was practiced at every level of Egyptian society, from the pharaoh hunting from a papyrus boat in a painted scene that communicated royal mastery over the natural world, to the ordinary marsh dweller who relied on birds as a significant protein source in his daily diet. The methods varied accordingly. Elite hunters pursued birds with throw sticks, flat, curved wooden implements, aerodynamically shaped, that were hurled into flocks to stun or bring down birds. This method required skill and practice, and it appears in elite tomb paintings frequently enough to suggest it was a genuinely valued accomplishment rather than a simple task. A man who was good with a throw stick in the marshes was a man worth knowing, for less sporting purposes, and for the bulk of actual food production. The Egyptians used large funnel traps and clap nets set in the marshes. A clap net was a large mesh net staked out flat on the water's surface, baited with grain, and triggered by a concealed watcher hauling a rope that folded the net suddenly closed over any birds that had landed on it. Multiple hunters working together could take very large numbers of birds this way, and tomb paintings documenting this technique are among the most energetic and detailed records we have of any Egyptian food production activity. You can see the birds caught in the closing net, the hunters hauling on the rope, the organized chaos of a good catch. These paintings have the feel of something observed directly, recorded by someone who had seen it happen and wanted to get the details right. The domestic production of fowl was equally developed. Egyptian households kept ducks, geese, and pigeons in considerable numbers, and from the New Kingdom period onward, there is evidence for something approaching organized industrial poultry production. Large fattening operations attached to temples and estates where birds were kept in enclosed facilities and fed intensively to build up fat reserves before slaughter. Geese in particular were fattened with forced feeding, the ancient precursor to the practices that produce foie gras today. And the product of this effort, a goose with a substantial layer of rendered fat beneath the skin, was a prized and expensive food item. The roasted goose that appears so frequently in depictions of Egyptian elite feasting was not simply any goose. It was a carefully fattened, specially prepared goose, and its presence at a table communicated something about the resources and status of the household that served it. Pigeons and doves were kept in dedicated dovecotes, towers of mud brick or stone with small nesting holes that housed large colonies of birds, and were consumed regularly at all levels of society. The pigeon towers of ancient Egypt were sophisticated structures, and their descendants exist in rural Egypt today in a form so similar to the ancient examples that the continuity is visible to the naked eye. A modern Egyptian pigeon tower and an ancient Egyptian pigeon tower are recognizably the same thing, separated by 3,000 years of history and very little architectural evolution. The design worked, and so it was kept. The question of how all these birds were prepared and cooked is one that tomb paintings and textual evidence address with welcome specificity. Roasting over open fire or in clay ovens was the primary method for whole birds, and the preparation before cooking appears to have involved cleaning, sometimes marinating in oil and aromatics, and in the case of geese and ducks, careful management of the abundant fat. Boiling in clay pots was another common method, producing a broth that could serve as the base of a more complex preparation. Some evidence suggests that strips of bird meat were also dried and salted for preservation, extending the useful life of a large catch beyond what fresh cooking could achieve. The ancient Egyptian kitchen was, within its material constraints, a resourceful place. Section 7. The luxury of meat, cattle, sheep, and the question of who ate what. Here is where Egyptian food history gets genuinely revealing in a way that tells us something important not just about what people ate, but about how society was organized around the distribution of its most valued resources. Beef, cattle meat, was in ancient Egypt primarily an elite food. Not exclusively so, and not at all times, but in terms of everyday consumption patterns. The picture that emerges from administrative records, from the skeletal remains of animals found at different types of sites, and from the visual evidence of tomb paintings, is one of a fairly clear social hierarchy of meat access. Cattle were valuable in ancient Egypt in ways that extended well beyond their value as food. They were draft animals, used to pull plows and to operate the threshing processes of grain production. Their hides were used for leather. Their dung was used as fuel and as a component in certain construction materials. A living cow or ox was worth considerably more than a dead one, and this meant that cattle were not slaughtered casually. They were slaughtered for specific occasions, for temple festivals, when large numbers of animals would be offered to the gods and then distributed to priests and worshippers, for royal feasts and the entertainments of the aristocracy, for significant life events among wealthy households, and for the ration allocations of very senior officials and skilled workers, for ordinary Egyptian workers and farmers, which is to say, the overwhelming majority of the population. Beef was a relatively rare treat rather than a regular feature of the diet. This is not unique to Egypt. In most pre-industrial societies, large domestic animals were too economically valuable to slaughter routinely, and meat consumption for most people centered on smaller animals, poultry, fish, and game. But what is interesting about Egypt is how systematically this reality was managed and recorded. Sheep and goats were somewhat more accessible than cattle, in the sense that they were less economically central, reproduced more quickly, and could be managed in larger numbers by smaller households. Mutton and goat meat appear in the archaeological record at a broader range of site types than beef, suggesting wider access across social classes. Pork is an interesting case. Pig bones are found at Egyptian domestic sites from early periods, and there is evidence of pig keeping at workers' settlements, but pork also carried certain ritual restrictions in some contexts. Herodotus, reliably confused about Egyptian religion while reliably fascinated by it, describes Egyptians as considering swine unclean. The actual picture was more nuanced and varied by period and region, as it so often is when you look closely enough at any ancient generalization. Some Egyptians ate pork, others didn't. The boundaries were not always clear, and they shifted over time. Game animals provided an important supplementary meat source for Egyptians across the social spectrum, though in different ways for different groups. The desert margins beyond the fertile Nile Valley were home to gazelle, oryx, ibex, and other wild ungulates, and hunting these animals was both a practical food-gathering activity for people near the desert edge and a sport of prestige for the elite. Large-scale desert hunts organized by pharaohs and high officials appear in inscriptions and paintings as significant events. Organized drives across the desert margin, using dogs, beaters, and nets to funnel game animals into enclosed areas where they could be taken in quantity. The logistics of these hunts were clearly planned and executed with the same administrative precision the Egyptians brought to everything. Hares were apparently quite commonly eaten. Small, numerous, relatively easy to catch with traps and dogs, and available in both the desert fringe and agricultural areas. Hedgehogs appear in the archaeological record with enough frequency to suggest they were eaten rather than merely encountered. Wild birds beyond the marshland varieties, quail in particular, which arrive on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast in exhausted, catchable thousands during the autumn migration, were taken and eaten in quantity by anyone in a position to do so. The ancient record of quail consumption in the Sinai Peninsula, where the birds were taken during migration, is preserved not just in Egyptian records, but in a rather famous passage of a much older text with which many of you will be familiar. But that is, perhaps, another evening's story. Section 8. The Pharaoh's Table. Elite and royal dining in ancient Egypt. If bread and beer represent the democratic baseline of Egyptian food culture, the great equalizer that every Egyptian consumed in some form, then the royal and aristocratic table represents the other end of the spectrum. Food as political theater, as religious statement, as the visible demonstration of divine favor and earthly power. The pharaoh did not simply eat. The pharaoh was sustained by the gods and demonstrated that sustenance to the world through the visible abundance of his table, which was, by any standard, remarkable. Royal menus reconstructed from palace administrative records, from the detailed offering lists in royal tombs, and from the physical remains of royal kitchens and storage facilities, reveal a breadth of food variety that would have been astonishing to the vast majority of the population. Multiple kinds of bread, including the enriched, sweetened, and flavored varieties that required expensive ingredients. Multiple grades of wine from identified estates. Specific cuts of beef, which appears at elite tables with a regularity entirely absent from ordinary households. Fattened geese and ducks prepared with aromatics and oil. Multiple fish preparations, including preserved varieties of high quality. Fruits in season and out of season. Dates, figs, pomegranates, grapes, along with the sweet preparations made from them. Honey in quantities that would have represented significant expense at any level below the royal household. Imported foods from the trade networks that Egypt maintained with the Levant, with Nubia, with the Eastern Mediterranean, things that arrived in Egypt as luxury goods and ended up on tables that could afford them. The question of spice and flavoring at the elite Egyptian table is one worth addressing directly, because it touches on a common modern misconception. We sometimes assume, partly because we associate elaborate spicing with later periods or other cultures, that ancient Egyptian food was relatively plain and unseasoned. The evidence does not support this. The elite Egyptian table in particular appears to have made extensive use of imported aromatics and flavoring agents that simply weren't available or affordable to ordinary households. Cinnamon and cassia, which came from somewhere in the East, the exact ancient trade routes for cinnamon are still a matter of scholarly discussion. Appear in Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period onward. Imported resins and aromatic plant materials with culinary as well as ritual applications are documented. The presence of these materials at elite contexts and their relative absence from ordinary household contexts says something about both the reach of Egypt's trade networks and the way in which luxury goods, then as in virtually every culture before and since, found their way first to the tables of those with the resources to obtain them. The banquet scene that appears so frequently in New Kingdom tomb paintings is a document of elite social life that repays close study. Guests are shown arriving, being greeted, and being given cones of perfumed fat to wear on their wigs. A fragrance delivery system that strikes modern observers as unusual, but which clearly communicated sophistication and expense. They are seated in order of status. Servants, many of them, in elaborate depictions, move between them with food, drink, and flowers. Musicians perform in groups. At some point, professional dancers perform. The food is abundant and varied, piled on low tables and offered in generous quantities. Wine is poured freely and consumed openly. In several paintings, guests are shown in various states of intoxication, and in at least one famous scene, a female guest is shown being attended to by a servant while clearly suffering the consequences of overly enthusiastic consumption. The Egyptians painted their feasts with documentary accuracy, which is to say, they painted them as they actually were, which apparently included all the predictable outcomes of combining abundant wine with a festive evening. The women present at Egyptian feasts, both as guests and as performers, deserve attention because the Egyptian banquet was notably more integrated in terms of gender than comparable events in some other ancient cultures. Egyptian aristocratic women attended feasts alongside their husbands and male peers, sat in positions of honor, were depicted consuming wine and enjoying the entertainment, and were shown receiving the same quality of food and service as the men beside them. This is not a minor detail. In the contemporary Greek and Near Eastern worlds, elite women were frequently excluded from formal banquets or confined to separate and secondary spaces. Egyptian social custom, at least at the elite level, did not operate this way. And the tomb paintings that document these events show women as full participants in the social life of their class, not as afterthoughts or footnotes. Elite Egyptian women also participated directly in the management of food production at the estate level. The position of household administrator, responsible for the supervision of kitchens, bakeries, brewing operations, and food stores, was not exclusively male, and there are documented examples of women in significant administrative roles over large domestic food production operations. The management of a large Egyptian estate's food supply was a skilled and responsible position, and the evidence suggests it was not automatically gendered in the way that later cultures would make it. The temple, as much as the palace, was a site of significant food consumption and food redistribution in ancient Egypt. Temple offerings, the daily presentation of food to the divine images in their sanctuary spaces, were organized and elaborate operations. Multiple meals were presented to each deity in the major temples, and these meals included bread, beer, meat, fowl, fish, vegetables, fruit, wine, milk, and other items arranged on offering tables in specified quantities and sequences. After the deity had, in theological terms, consumed the spiritual essence of the offering, the physical food was redistributed to the priests who served the temple, to the attached workshops and institutional households, and through a complex system of secondary and tertiary redistribution outward into the broader community. The temple was not merely a religious institution. It was also a food distribution node in the broader Egyptian economic system, a mechanism by which surplus food generated by temple estates was organized, stored, and then spread through the population in patterns that served both ritual and social purposes. This system meant that ordinary Egyptians, those who would never sit at a feast table with roasted goose and fine wine, had periodic access to food from temple redistributions at festival times that was significantly better than their everyday diet. The great religious festivals of the Egyptian calendar, which were numerous, were also, in a very practical sense, feast days, on which the food that normally circulated only among the elite was, for a specific time, made available more broadly. The boundary between religious observance and communal eating was, in ancient Egypt, not a boundary at all. It was the same thing. Those of you who grew up with strong traditions around food at religious or community occasions, the church potluck, the holiday meal that was genuinely different from the everyday table, the community feast that marked something important, will recognize something in this. Food as shared ceremony is one of the oldest human patterns there is. If you have a story about a food tradition in your family that carried that same weight, something that was only made on certain days, for certain reasons, I'd be glad to hear it in the comments. Section 9. What the workers ate. Rations, records, and the daily reality of ordinary life. We have, in the case of the village of Deir el-Medina, something genuinely unusual in the ancient world, a detailed, well-preserved, extensively studied documentary record of what ordinary working people actually ate day by day, over a substantial period of time. Deir el-Medina was a purpose-built settlement on the west bank of the Nile, constructed to house the specialized workers, tomb builders, painters, sculptors, draftsmen, and their families, responsible for cutting, decorating, and furnishing the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not ordinary laborers. They were skilled craftsmen in hereditary occupations, literate to an unusually high degree by ancient standards, and supported by the Egyptian state with rations that were carefully recorded, periodically adjusted, and critically complained about with great specificity when they failed to arrive on time. The papyri and ostraka, limestone flakes and pottery fragments used as informal writing surfaces, recovered from Deir el-Medina, include work rosters, legal documents, love poetry, letters, and, most relevant to our purposes tonight, detailed administrative records of ration deliveries. These records tell us, with a precision unusual for the ancient world, what workers received, in what quantities, on what schedule, and what happened when the system broke down. They are among the most humanizing documents to survive from ancient Egypt, because they show us not the grand sweep of pharaonic civilization, but the ordinary texture of working life. The irritation of a delayed grain delivery. The satisfaction of a full ration month. The formal complaint submitted when a worker's allocation arrived short. The standard ration allocation for a male worker at Deir el-Medina during the New Kingdom period was approximately 4 emmer wheat sacks and 1.5 barley sacks per month. A sack in this context, the car, contained roughly 76 liters of grain. Enough when processed into bread and beer to sustain a man through a month of hard physical labor with some margin to spare. Women workers, female members of the Deir el-Medina community who performed essential work including textile production, washing, grinding, and various administrative and support roles, received somewhat smaller grain allocations, a differential that appears throughout the ancient world, and which modern historians note without finding it entirely surprising, even while noting that it reflected the systematic undervaluation of women's labor that was, then as in many later periods, a structural feature of organized societies rather than a reflection of actual economic contribution. Additional rations distributed irregularly, but with documented regularity included fish, both fresh and dried, delivered in quantities that varied with season and availability. Vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, when in season and when the supply system was functioning smoothly. Oil for cooking and lamp fuel, salt, and on specific festival occasions and royal anniversaries, special allocations that might include meat, wine, additional oil, natron, and other items that don't appear in the ordinary monthly record. These festival allocations were not trivial additions. They were significant events in the annual food calendar of the workers, anticipated, recorded, and when they were delayed or reduced, complained about with the particular indignation of people who had been relying on them. The records also document with uncomfortable clarity the occasions when the system failed. Papyrus records from Deir el-Medina include what are among the earliest documented labor actions in human history. Work stoppages by the tomb workers, triggered directly by failures in the ration delivery system. On at least several occasions during the reign of Ramesses III, in the mid-12th century before the Common Era, the workers at Deir el-Medina walked off the construction site, assembled outside the administrative facilities of the nearby mortuary temples, and formally demanded that their overdue rations be delivered. They were not seeking political power. They were not challenging the social order. They were not, in any ideological sense, revolutionaries. They were skilled workers who had not been paid, in food, for work they had done, and they wanted what they were owed. The administrative responses documented in surviving papyri reveal a system under genuine strain in this period, with officials scrambling to source grain from various temple storehouses, negotiating and promising and occasionally delivering partial payments, while the broader systemic problems of late New Kingdom administration ground slowly onward. The workers, for their part, returned to work when they received their rations, which is to say, their objectives were practical rather than political, their methods were organized rather than violent, and their record of this interaction, preserved in papyrus, gives us a window into the specific, lived experience of what it meant when the food supply was not reliable. Hunger in the ancient world had a very direct relationship with organized discontent. This will not surprise anyone who has thought carefully about history. The diet of the workers, when the system was functioning well, was nutritionally adequate for the demands of their labor, which was considerable. Cutting and decorating rock-cut tombs in the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings involved sustained, hard physical work in confined spaces, carrying heavy loads up and down the rocky path between the valley and the village, and the various crafts, painting, sculpting, plasterwork, woodwork, that required skilled concentration, sustained over long days. The bread and beer that formed the caloric core of their diet provided the carbohydrates and moderate alcohol that fueled and sustained this work. The fish, vegetables, and occasional meat provided protein and micronutrients. The oil provided essential fat. It was not a glamorous diet, but it was a thought-out one, calibrated by the Egyptian state's administrative apparatus to the requirements of a specific kind of labor, adjusted periodically based on conditions and understood by both the state and the workers themselves as a form of compensation that had specific, understood, and enforceable terms. What the workers did with their rations once received is also to some degree documented. Surplus grain could be traded within the community for goods and services. The ostraka from Deir el-Medina record an active informal economy in which grain and oil functioned as currency. One workman trading a portion of his grain ration for a sandal repair, another exchanging oil for a piece of pottery, a woman receiving grain in exchange for washing another family's laundry. The ration system was not merely a mechanism for feeding the workers. It was also the foundation of the village's entire internal economy. Every transaction, every exchange, every piece of work done within the community ultimately traced back in one way or another to the grain and oil that arrived from the state in monthly deliveries. Section 10. Food and the body, medicine, nutrition, and the Egyptian understanding of what food does. The Egyptians did not have our understanding of nutrition. They had no concept of vitamins, no knowledge of proteins or carbohydrates in a biochemical sense, no awareness of microorganisms as agents of disease or fermentation. And yet, in their practical, empirical, observation-based understanding of the relationship between food and health, they arrived at a number of conclusions that hold up remarkably well under modern scrutiny. The medical papyri, particularly the Ebers papyrus, the Edwin Smith papyrus, and the Cahun papyrus, the last of which is specifically focused on women's health, contain hundreds of dietary prescriptions that blend the therapeutic with the nutritional in ways that blur our modern distinctions between the two. The Ebers papyrus alone contains over 700 remedies, a very large proportion of which involve food substances: honey, garlic, onion, figs, pomegranate, castor oil, coriander, fenugreek, and dozens of other plant materials that appear in the everyday Egyptian diet are prescribed in specific preparations for specific conditions. Some of these prescriptions, evaluated by modern pharmacologists, contain active compounds that do what the Egyptians claimed they would do. Honey's wound-healing properties are confirmed. Garlic's cardiovascular effects are documented. Pomegranate rind's anti-parasitic properties have been verified. The Egyptians were not doing pharmacology in the modern sense. but they were doing something that produced genuine results through long, careful observation, and the food they were using as medicine was largely the same food they were eating every day, which raises the interesting question of whether the Egyptian diet itself, in its ordinary form, had significant health protective properties, not by design, but simply because the same plants that happen to taste good also happen to be good for you. The Kahan papyrus, which focuses specifically on gynecological and obstetric medicine, is illuminating on the subject of food and women's health in ancient Egypt. It prescribes specific dietary regimens for pregnant and nursing women, recommending particular foods believed to support milk production, to ease certain conditions of pregnancy, and to strengthen women during recovery from childbirth. The very existence of this document, and it is genuinely ancient, dating to around 1825 before the Common Era, tells us that Egyptian medical culture was applying the same careful empirical observation to women's dietary needs as to general medicine, and that this was considered worth recording and preserving. Women's nutritional health in the Egyptian medical framework was a specific area of knowledge with its own literature. Egyptian physicians also had an understanding, expressed in their own conceptual framework, which involved channels they called metu running through the body, of the relationship between diet and digestive health, between constipation and illness, and between the maintenance of what they understood as the body's internal pathways and overall well-being. Many of their dietary prescriptions are, in effect, what we would recognize as interventions aimed at digestive health. The use of fiber-rich foods, of oils to ease intestinal function, of certain plant preparations to address bloating or obstruction. Again, the specific mechanism they understood was not the mechanism we understand today. The practical outcomes they were aiming for and often achieving were recognizable. One of the more interesting dimensions of Egyptian food as medicine was the systematic use of dietary changes as treatment for specific identified conditions. The concept that you might address a medical problem by deliberately altering what a person ate, reducing certain foods, increasing others, prescribing specific preparations at specific times of day, is one that sounds entirely modern, but appears in Egyptian medical papyri with considerable specificity. A physician treating a patient with what sounds, from the symptoms described, like a cardiovascular condition, might prescribe a diet emphasizing onions and garlic, while reducing certain fatty preparations. A physician treating what sounds like a parasitic infestation, a common problem in a population living in close contact with Nile water, might prescribe a multi-day course of treatment involving pomegranate preparations, which do, in fact, have significant anti-parasitic activity. The prescriptions were embedded in a magical and spiritual framework that mixed prayer, ritual, and practical intervention in ways we might find unusual. But strip away the framework, and the practical core of what was being recommended was, in many cases, sound. The Egyptians also understood, implicitly, that different people needed different food. Laborers needed more calories than sedentary administrators. Pregnant women needed different nutritional support than healthy men. Sick people needed different preparation of food than well ones. The ration system reflected this understanding. Heavier work attracted larger rations. Specialized workers received additional allocations. Festival occasions provided everyone with access to foods normally unavailable to them. This is not nutrition science, but it is something recognizable as nutritional intuition, developed through millennia of observation and refined through the administrative practice of a civilization that was, at its best, remarkably good at organizing practical things. Section 11. The Children's Table. Growing up in ancient Egypt. Children in ancient Egypt began their relationship with food in much the same way children have always begun it, everywhere, with their mother's milk. which Egyptian culture strongly supported and for which there were specific prayers, medical preparations to support its production, and a recognized period of nursing that might extend to 2 or 3 years in some households and circumstances. The medical papyri contain preparations specifically intended to test whether a mother's milk was good for her child, a genuine expression of concern for infant nutrition, as well as preparations intended to support or increase milk supply. The Egyptians, characteristically, approached infant feeding with the same practical attentiveness they brought to other aspects of food management. The transition to solid food was gradual, and the food to which Egyptian children transitioned was, initially, a softened version of the adult diet. Bread soaked in liquid to soften it, lentil or grain porridge of varying thickness, mashed or softened dates and figs, carefully strained preparations of stew with the chunky elements removed. This is not a formal cookery tradition we have textual evidence for. No surviving papyrus describes a recipe specifically for infant food, but it is what the available food was and what practical mothers would have done with it, and the physical evidence of Egyptian children's teeth, examined by archaeologists, confirms a developmental pattern consistent with gradual introduction of soft, then progressively firmer foods over the first years of life. As Egyptian children grew, they gradually joined the full family diet. The communal eating pattern of ordinary Egyptian households, family members sharing food from a central vessel, seated together on reed mats, would have been the context in which children learned what food was, what it tasted like, and what the social expectations around eating were. Egyptian paintings depicting family meals show children sitting with adults at the communal food, eating the same food in smaller quantities, being served by their mothers or older siblings. There was no separate children's menu, no special formulation for small people. There was the family's food, and children ate it. What this means in nutritional terms is that an Egyptian child's diet broadly tracked the adult diet, with its strengths and its occasional weaknesses. The strengths were significant. A diet built on whole grain, legumes, vegetables, fruit, and fish provided a reasonably complete nutritional foundation, and Egyptian children in periods when the agricultural and ration systems were functioning well were not nutritionally starved in the way that children in some other ancient and later societies demonstrably were. The weaknesses were also real. In drought years, in periods of administrative breakdown, in late New Kingdom disruption, the consequences of an interrupted food supply fell hardest on the most vulnerable, the young, the elderly, the sick, as they always do. The skeletal evidence from poor periods in Egyptian history shows reduced height, increased rates of childhood disease, and the bone changes consistent with nutritional stress. The good years and the bad years left different marks, and the bodies of the past carry that record in their bones. There is one detail of Egyptian children's food experience that stands out in the historical record for its unexpected charm. The discovery, in various archaeological contexts, of small clay figures, toys, in the shape of animals, and specifically in the shape of animals that were also food animals. Small clay pigs, cows, birds, fish, found in children's play contexts, apparently used as toys. The same animals that appeared on the family table or in the market, recreated in miniature for children to hold and play with. This particular intersection of the familiar and the beloved is, across the millennia, immediately recognizable. The child who plays with a toy animal and the child who eats the animal at dinner are the same child, navigating the same fundamental relationship between the living world and the eating world that human children have always had to work out for themselves. The Egyptians apparently found nothing contradictory in this, and neither, one suspects, did their children. Section 12. Against decay. Food preservation and the technology of keeping things. Egypt is, in many ways, the ideal country for food preservation. The air is dry. The desert climate, which defines most of the country's geography, even in the narrow, fertile valley, is hostile to the microorganisms and insects that are food's primary enemies in storage. Temperatures are relatively stable in underground or built storage facilities, and the Egyptians, who were brilliant administrators by any standard, took the preservation and storage of food with extraordinary seriousness. Because in a civilization dependent on an annual flood cycle that could always produce too little water or too much, the ability to store food against lean years was not an organizational preference, but a survival imperative. The silos and granaries of ancient Egypt were among the most architecturally significant and administratively complex structures in the civilization, second only to temples and tombs in the care devoted to their design and management. Large granaries attached to temples and palaces were beehive-shaped structures of mud brick, built with thick walls and sealed openings that maintained relatively stable internal temperatures and low humidity, protected from insects by careful construction and from vermin by resident populations of cats, which is, incidentally, at least partially why cats were so highly valued in ancient Egypt. The cat that protected the grain store was not merely a pet. It was working infrastructure. It earned its keep in the most literal possible sense. The methods of food preservation the Egyptians employed were, by the standards of any pre-refrigeration era, comprehensive. Grain was dried thoroughly before storage, a step that reduced moisture content below the threshold at which mold and bacterial activity could proceed, and then sealed in containers or in purpose-built pit and silo structures. The dry Egyptian climate was an enormous asset here. Grain stored in Egyptian granaries could remain viable for years, and the legendary story of Joseph in Egypt interpreting Pharaoh's dream of 7 fat years and 7 lean years as a call to store grain against future famine is not mythologically improbable. It describes exactly the kind of multi-year grain storage strategy that Egyptian administrative records show the civilization actually practiced. Whether or not you take the story literally, the agricultural and administrative context it describes is historically accurate. Meat preservation relied on a combination of drying, salting, and in some cases, smoking, and the results could be stored for months. Dried and salted meat strips have been found in numerous archaeological contexts, and their treatment is consistent enough across sites to suggest standardized production methods rather than improvised individual preservation efforts. The best preserved examples, some dating back to the Old Kingdom, give us direct physical evidence of the specific techniques used, the orientation of the cuts, the depth of salt penetration, the degree of drying before storage, and the kind of containers used for transport and long-term keeping. Fruit preservation was achieved primarily through drying, a method that concentrates sugars, reduces water activity to levels inhospitable to spoilage, and produces a product that is, in some respects, superior to the fresh original for long-term storage and transport. Dried figs, dried dates, raisins, pressed from grapes into dense clusters or cakes, have been found in Egyptian archaeological contexts in excellent states of preservation, sometimes still identifiable to variety, and sometimes still retaining enough cellular structure that researchers can make meaningful observations about how they were processed before drying. The date palm produced not only fresh fruit for immediate consumption and dried dates for storage, but also date wine and a thick date syrup that functioned as a liquid sweetener and preservative in its own right, its high sugar content creating an environment hostile to microbial growth that made it, effectively, both flavoring and preservation agent simultaneously. Olive oil and other vegetable oils were stored in sealed ceramic vessels that protected them from light and air, the two primary agents of oil degradation. The Egyptians understood without knowing the chemistry, that well-sealed oil in a cool, dark space lasted significantly longer than oil left exposed, and their storage vessels for oil are consistently well-made, well-sealed, and found in the kinds of shaded underground storage spaces that maximize their functional life. This is not sophisticated chemistry. It is careful observation, applied with the organizational thoroughness that characterized Egyptian administration at its best. Honey, as mentioned earlier, requires special acknowledgement in any discussion of Egyptian food preservation, because it serves double duty as both a preserved food and a preservative in its own right. Honey's antimicrobial properties, derived from its hydrogen peroxide content, its low water activity, and its acidity, made it effective not only as a wound treatment, but as a preservative for food preparations, and, in one of the more remarkable applications in Egyptian practice, for bodies. Ancient Egyptian recipes for sweet preserves and confections frequently include honey as the primary medium, precisely because it prevented spoilage. Honey-preserved preparations have been found in sealed vessels in tombs, and in at least some cases they were still chemically recognizable as food thousands of years after they were placed there. The specific question of how Egyptian food preservation was managed at the administrative level deserves a moment, because it reveals something about the organizational sophistication of the civilization. Large-scale food storage in Egypt was not simply a matter of putting things in jars and hoping. It involved systematic rotation, older stock consumed before newer arrivals in the same basic principle that governs any well-run modern larder or warehouse. It involved inspection and monitoring of stored goods. It involved the sealing, labeling, and dating of storage vessels with enough specificity that the contents, their provenance, and their storage date could be determined without opening them. The wine jars found in the tombs of Tutankhamun and other royal burials are among the best examples of this. They carry labels specifying vintage year, estate of origin, quality grade, and vintner, allowing modern Egyptologists to reconstruct the contents of a royal cellar laid down over 3,000 years ago with a specificity that would not embarrass a modern sommelier. Whether or not any wine of that vintage would have survived to remain drinkable is a separate question. The administrative infrastructure for knowing what you had and where it came from was entirely functional. Section 13. Food and the Gods. Offerings, ritual, and the spiritual dimension of eating. The relationship between food and the divine in ancient Egypt was not metaphorical. It was, within the Egyptian religious framework, entirely literal. The gods required food to maintain their cosmic functions. The temples were the places where that food was provided, and the entire agricultural system of Egypt, the flood cycle, the planting, the harvest, the processing, the storage, was understood as a component of the divine order that the gods maintained and that humans were obligated to support through offerings. This is not a peripheral aspect of Egyptian religion. It is central to it. The cosmic contract at the heart of Egyptian civilization was essentially this. The gods maintained the Nile flood and the order of the world, and the Egyptians maintained the gods through the provision of food, labor, prayer, and correct ritual conduct. The daily temple ritual, performed in major temples throughout Egypt from the earliest periods through the late Roman period, a span of roughly 3,000 years, was organized almost entirely around the feeding and care of the divine image. Each morning the sanctuary was opened. The deity's image was uncovered, dressed, anointed, and presented with food. A full range of foodstuffs laid out in the specific quantities and sequences prescribed by ritual tradition. The meal was presented, prayers were spoken, and the deity was understood to have consumed the spiritual essence of the offering. The physical food was then removed, after an appropriate interval for divine consumption, and redistributed through the temple staff and their dependents in an organized system of secondary distribution called reversion of offerings. Every loaf of bread on an Egyptian temple offering table had, in principle, a divine use and a human one. Nothing was wasted. The god's dinner became the priest's dinner, became the worker's dinner, in a chain of redistribution that connected the divine and the human through the most fundamental biological necessity. The food placed in tombs for the dead deserves particular attention, because it gives us some of our most directly physical evidence of what Egyptians considered both practically necessary and symbolically important in the category of food. The funerary provisions of wealthy Egyptians, ranging from the modest caches of food found in middle-class burials to the extraordinary abundance documented in royal tombs, tell us what food meant to them, because they were choosing to commit real, valuable food to the care of the dead at the cost of removing it from the circulation of the living. The finds from the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, are particularly instructive. Among the extraordinary objects recovered were sealed food containers holding the remains of meats, carefully preserved cuts of beef, duck, and goat, wrapped in linen and sealed in white-painted wooden boxes, sealed wine amphorae with their labels intact, jars of honey, boxes of grain, dried fruits, a variety of seeds and spices. These were not token offerings. They were a genuine royal pantry, assembled with the care and selection that a thoughtful person would bring to provisioning a very long journey. The Egyptians, who believed quite sincerely in the continuation of the individual beyond death, were not being symbolic. They were being practical. If you're going to live forever, you're going to need something to eat. The magical dimension of Egyptian food offerings extended to the very walls of the tombs. The offering formula, a standard hieroglyphic text that translates roughly as an offering which the king gives to Osiris so that he may give offerings of bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, and all good and pure things to the spirit of name of the deceased, was carved or painted into virtually every Egyptian tomb of any social standing. The recitation of this formula, or even the reading of it by a passerby, was believed to conjure the offering into existence for the benefit of the dead. This means that inscribed on the walls of Egyptian tombs throughout the Nile Valley, right now, at this moment, are lists of food: bread, beer, meat, fowl, oil, vegetables, fruit, that were intended to provide sustenance to the dead for eternity. The ancient Egyptians inscribed their grocery lists on the walls of their tombs and expected them to work. And for 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, more or less everyone agreed that they did. The practical and the sacred were not, in Egyptian thought, opposing categories. A loaf of bread was food for the body. A loaf of bread was an offering to the god. A loaf of bread inscribed on a tomb wall was sustenance for the dead. These were not three different things. They were the same thing, understood from three different positions in the cosmic order that the Egyptians had constructed to make sense of a world in which the annual flood determined whether people lived or died. The intersection of food and faith, the meal that is also a prayer, the harvest that is also a gift to something larger than yourself, appears in almost every human culture across recorded history and back before it. Those of you from traditions where food has that kind of double weight, where the cooking or the sharing of a particular dish is also an act of remembrance or gratitude or connection to those who've gone before, I genuinely enjoy hearing about it in the comments. These ancient Egyptians weren't so different in that particular impulse. Section 14. The world on the table. Foreign foods, trade, and what Egypt borrowed. Egypt was not an isolated civilization. It is a common misconception, partly fostered by the sheer visual dominance of Egyptian monumental culture, which tends to present itself as self-sufficient and self-contained, that the Egyptians developed their food culture in a kind of magnificent isolation. In fact, From very early periods, Egypt was embedded in a web of trade connections that regularly brought foreign goods into the Nile Valley, and Egyptian foodways were shaped and enriched by what those connections delivered. The most important trade partner for Egyptian luxury goods, including food, was the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coastal region encompassing modern Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and parts of Syria. From the Levant came wine in substantial quantities, olive oil, timber, and a range of preserved and dried foodstuffs that complemented what Egypt produced domestically. The relationship was not one-directional. Egypt exported grain, papyrus, linen, gold, and manufactured goods in exchange, and the trading cities of the Levantine coast developed economically in relationship with Egyptian demand and Egyptian supply. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was, in essence, an interconnected economic zone, and Egypt, with its annual agricultural surplus generated by the Nile flood, was a major player in the food trade of that world. Nubia, the civilization immediately to the south of Egypt along the Nile in modern Sudan, was another crucial trade partner and cultural interlocutor, and the relationship between Egypt and Nubia was complex, long, and often difficult in ways that extended well beyond food. But in the context of food specifically, Nubia was a conduit for goods from the deeper African interior. Certain spices and aromatics, animal products including ivory and exotic hides, and through Nubia's own agricultural traditions, food plants and techniques that enriched the Egyptian repertoire. The sorghum varieties grown in Nubia, the different cattle breeds of the Sudanese Nile, the dried tropical fruits carried along trade routes from further south. All of these touched Egyptian tables at one level or another, and the cultural exchange between Egypt and Nubia over 3,000 years of complex coexistence left marks on both civilizations' food cultures that are not fully documented but are traceable in the archaeological record. The Punt expeditions deserve their own moment here, because they represent one of the most evocative examples of ancient Egyptians going to considerable effort and expense to obtain specific food-related products they considered worth having. Punt, a land the Egyptians visited at various points throughout the New Kingdom and earlier periods, likely located somewhere in the area of modern Somalia, Eritrea, or the southern Red Sea coast, was the source of myrrh and frankincense trees, which the Egyptians actually transplanted back to Egypt in specially constructed containers on their expedition ships. They wanted the trees themselves, not just the resin. They wanted to grow frankincense and myrrh in Egypt. The expedition of Queen Hatshepsut to Punt, documented in remarkable carved and painted reliefs on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, shows expedition ships loaded with live trees in clay balls, their root systems preserved for replanting. This was not a casual shopping trip. This was a horticultural expedition, organized at state level to bring back to Egypt a plant that the Egyptians had decided they needed in a way that simple trade could not satisfy. The foreign foods that entered Egypt through trade were not consumed equally across the population, and it is worth being clear about this. Imported wine, imported olive oil, cinnamon, and the aromatic resins that arrived from the Levant and from trade networks further east were luxury goods that circulated among the elite and within temple contexts. The ordinary farmer in the delta, the craftsman in Deir el-Medina, the fishermen working the Nile channels, none of them were eating cinnamon-spiced bread or drinking Lebanese wine as a matter of course. Their diet was domestic. It was local. It was the bread and beer and fish and onions of the Egyptian baseline, produced and consumed within the agricultural system of the Nile Valley itself. But here is what is interesting about the trickle-down effect of luxury trade in ancient Egypt. The elite consumption of foreign goods created demand that over time shaped what the broader population had access to. Pomegranates, which arrived as a luxury import during the Second Intermediate period, were within a few generations being grown in Egyptian household gardens. New varieties of grain introduced through trade contacts were gradually integrated into the agricultural system. Cooking techniques observed through contact with foreign populations were absorbed and adapted. The Egyptian food culture was not static. It was, over 3,000 years, continuously incorporating the new, quietly, without fanfare, with the practical Egyptian preference for what works over what is traditional, while maintaining the deep structural continuity of a diet built on the gifts of the Nile flood. What emerges when you draw back and look at the full picture of Egyptian food from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom and beyond is something more complex, more varied, and more human than the popular image usually suggests. This was not a civilization eating austerely in the shadow of the pyramids. It was a civilization that over 3,000 years of continuous practice had developed a food culture of real breadth, one that sustained enormous populations through careful agricultural management and administrative organization, that fed its workers and its gods with equivalent seriousness, that absorbed foreign foods and techniques with practical curiosity, that preserved the knowledge of what it ate in the walls of its tombs and the records of its scribes, and that, at its ordinary, everyday level, produced food that was genuinely good, seasoned, varied, thoughtfully prepared by people who knew their craft. The bread was gritty, the beer was thick, the onions were sharp, and the garlic was pungent, and the fish had been sitting in the sun for parts of their preservation process that we would, in the modern era, prefer not to dwell on. But it was real food. It was food made with care by people who understood what they were doing, embedded in a civilization that knew the value of what it ate, knew it in economic terms, in spiritual terms, in medical terms, and in the simple daily terms of feeding a family at the end of a long day beside the oldest river in the human story. Section 15. What remains? The continuity of Egyptian food across 3 millennia. There is a particular quality to historical continuity that is easy to describe abstractly and difficult to fully feel until you encounter it in a specific, concrete form. And Egyptian food history is full of those concrete forms. The full medames that simmers in homes across Egypt and the Middle East every morning. The fava beans soaked overnight and cooked slowly until soft, then dressed with oil, lemon and cumin, is the same dish, made from the same bean, using the same basic method, that Egyptian farmers and workers were eating 4,000 years ago. Not something similar, not something evolved beyond recognition, the same dish. The bean hasn't changed, the oil hasn't changed, the cumin hasn't changed, the principle of slow cooking hasn't changed. What we call breakfast, they called breakfast. The unbroken thread between that ancient kitchen and this modern one is one of the most remarkable forms of cultural continuity on Earth. The bread sold in flat rounds from Egyptian bakeries today, the aish baladi, the everyday Egyptian flatbread, made from whole wheat flour and baked in hot ovens until it puffs and chars slightly at the edges, is not identical to ancient Egyptian bread. The wheat is different, the yeast strains are different, the ovens are different. But the basic conception is the same. A round, whole grain, slightly chewy flatbread that is the foundation of a meal, torn and used to scoop and carry food, eaten in enormous quantities by people who rely on it as their primary caloric staple. Walk through a Cairo market this afternoon, and you will watch someone tear a piece of aish baladi in exactly the way that the painted figures in Egyptian tomb paintings have been tearing bread for 3,000 years. The gesture is identical. The intention is identical. The food is, in all the ways that matter most, the same food. The date palms that line the Nile are the same date palms that the ancient Egyptians tended, harvested, pressed into syrup, fermented into wine, and climbed with rope techniques that haven't changed in recognizable form. The onions growing in market gardens along the river's edge are the descendants of the same allium strains that Herodotus noted in the 5th century, that fed the pyramid builders, that were tucked into mummy wrappings as provisions for eternity. The catfish in the Nile, the enormous whiskered Nile catfish that modern Egyptian fishermen catch and cook over open fires on the riverbank, is the same species in the same river that ancient Egyptian fishermen speared from papyrus boats, while their wives processed the surplus catch for drying and salting. The continuity is not metaphorical. It is biological. It is genetic. It runs unbroken through 4,000 years of human occupation of this specific valley. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it changes the way we think about the distance between ourselves and the ancient Egyptians. We tend to think of them as remote, buried under the archaeological evidence of 3,000 years, accessible only through their painted walls and their preserved dead, and their administrative records, written in a script that no living person could read until the Rosetta Stone was deciphered. And in some ways, they are remote. Their religion is gone. Their language is gone. The specific texture of their daily life is accessible to us only through the patient reconstruction of scholars and archaeologists. But their food is not gone. Walk into any Egyptian home this evening, anywhere in the Nile Valley, and something is cooking that would not have been entirely unfamiliar to a woman grinding grain in Deir el-Medina in 1200 before the Common Era. That particular kind of continuity is rare. It is worth noting. The archaeology of Egyptian food has itself been a story of continuous discovery and revision. What we thought we knew 30 years ago about Egyptian diet has been substantially enriched and in places corrected by subsequent decades of more sophisticated analysis. The development of techniques like stable isotope analysis, which can determine from the chemistry of ancient bones and teeth what proportion of a person's diet came from different food categories, has allowed researchers to test the picture built from textual and visual evidence against the direct biological record of what individual Egyptians actually ate. In some cases, the results confirm what the documents say. In others, they reveal patterns the documents didn't capture. The higher proportion of animal protein in the diet of certain elite groups, the reliance on fish among riverside communities that the administrative records undercount, the variations in diet quality between different periods that track the rises and falls of Egyptian state capacity. The analysis of dental remains has been particularly revealing, not only in documenting the ubiquitous dental wear from gritty bread that we mentioned earlier, but in tracking patterns of dietary disease, the evidence of nutritional stress in periods of shortage, the patterns of caries and dental health that track changes in the proportion of sugary foods in the diet over time, the specific markers of parasitic infestation that confirm the medical papyri's concern with the problem. The ancient Egyptians cannot speak to us directly, but their bodies are still telling us things quietly and with increasing specificity about what their lives were like and what they ate. Section 16. What they understood that we sometimes forget. There is something the ancient Egyptians understood about food that is genuinely worth thinking about, and that we, with our nutritional databases, our calorie-counting applications, our industrial supply chains that deliver anything to anywhere at any season, sometimes lose sight of in the complexity. They understood that food is relationship to the land, which provides it, relationship to the labor, which produces it, relationship to the people who prepare it and the people who share it, relationship to the divine order that makes the flood come and the grain grow and the fish run in the river, relationship to the dead, who are provisioned for eternity with the same bread and beer that the living eat today. The offering formula carved on the walls of Egyptian tombs, an offering of bread, beer, oxen, fowl, and all good and pure things, was not a grocery list, not really. It was a statement about what a human being needed. Not just physically, not just calorically, but in the fullest sense. The bread that is food and currency and sacrament, the beer that is nutrition and social bond and daily comfort, the meat that is festival and celebration and the visible expression of abundance, the fruit that is sweetness and pleasure and the gift of a generous world. They needed all of it, and they knew they needed all of it, and they said so in the most permanent medium they had. The ancient Egyptians also understood, with a clarity that required no nutritional science, that food security was the foundation of everything else. The agricultural administration of the Nile Valley, the measurement of the flood, the assessment of the harvest, the storage of grain against lean years, the distribution of rations through the state's institutional networks, was not a bureaucratic exercise in organization for its own sake. It was the primary mechanism by which the civilization kept itself alive and functional. The pharaoh's most fundamental responsibility was not military, not religious, not architectural, though it was all of those things. His most fundamental responsibility was the maintenance of Ma'at, the divine order. And the most concrete expression of Ma'at in any given year was whether the flood came and the grain grew and people had enough to eat. A pharaoh whose granaries were full was fulfilling his cosmic role. A pharaoh whose people were hungry had, in some sense, failed at the most basic level of his divine charge. This is not unique to Egypt. Every civilization, in every period, has organized itself at some level around the management of food, its production, its storage, its distribution, its preservation. What is interesting about Egypt is how explicitly this was acknowledged, how openly the connection between cosmic order and agricultural abundance was stated, how directly the food offering to the god and the ration to the worker were understood as expressions of the same underlying principle. The divine table and the worker's table were the same table, provisioned from the same source, maintained by the same set of obligations. The god needed to eat. The worker needed to eat. The dead needed to eat. And it was the pharaoh's job, the civilization's job, to make sure that everyone, at every level of that hierarchy, had what they needed. What the ancient Egyptians ate was, in its broad outlines, simple. Bread, beer, fish, onions, lentils, dates. The gifts of a river that came every year and left behind the black soil in which everything grew. It was a diet built on the land's specific generosity and constrained by the land's specific limitations, managed with extraordinary organizational intelligence by a civilization that understood, in its bones, in its religious framework, in its administrative practice, in its art and its medicine and its daily routine, that the relationship between people and food was the most fundamental relationship of all. They were not so different from us. They grew things and stored them. They cooked over fire and ate around a common vessel. They fed their children carefully and worried when food was short. They celebrated abundance with feasts and preserved their surpluses against lean years with all the skill they could bring to the task. They flavored their food to make it taste better because they liked things that tasted good. They gave the best of what they had to their gods and their dead because they understood that the most important things in life deserved the most important food. They passed their food traditions from parent to child across generations until those traditions became the invisible fabric of daily life. The things you do without thinking because that is how it has always been done. Because your mother did it, and her mother before her, all the way back in an unbroken line to the black silt fields of the ancient Nile. There is a word the ancient Egyptians used, nefer. It appears carved on countless tomb walls, painted in endless inscriptions, woven through the hieroglyphic record of 3,000 years of civilization. It means good. It means beautiful. It means complete. It was applied to faces and to actions, and to days and to music and to work done well. And when you read an ancient Egyptian administrative record describing a meal, the bread fresh, the beer cool, the fish well preserved, the onions pungent, the dates sweet, you occasionally encounter the word nefer there too. The food is good, the meal is good, the day in all its ordinary completeness is good. They were hungry when the flood was late. They were fed when the flood was generous. They complained when their rations were delayed, and they celebrated when the festival allocations arrived, and they cooked their fish and their onions and their lentils over small clay braziers in the evenings beside the oldest river in human memory, and they sat with their families in the lamplight, and they ate, and it was, in all the ways that counted, good. And in the quiet of history, their voices still echo, if we are willing to listen. The bread they made has become the bread we make. The river that fed them feeds, in its altered form, a civilization still. The onions that sharpened their cooking season ours. The dates they pressed into sweetness grow heavy and golden on the same palms beside the same river. The thread is thin in places and thick in others, but it runs without interruption from those ancient kitchens to our own, a filament of flour and salt and fire, and the human need unchanged across every millennium, to sit down with the people you love and eat something warm and real and good. Tonight we followed bread from grain to oven, beer from grain to fermentation jar, fish from river to drying rack, geese from marsh to roasting spit, dates from palm to syrup to sweetened bread to the eternal offering table. We walked through the workers' village and read their complaints and their rations. We stood in the royal kitchen on a feast day, and in the domestic kitchen on an ordinary one. We opened the sealed granaries and the sealed tombs. We read the medical prescriptions and the administrative records and the walls of 1,000 painted chambers where food is stacked in painted abundance for painted eternity. We did all of this because the ancient Egyptians were worth knowing this well, because they were not simply the builders of famous monuments or the subjects of famous discoveries, but people who grew food and cooked it and shared it and worried about having enough of it and celebrated when they did and mourned when they didn't and understood in their bones the fundamental truth that every civilization in every era has had to learn and relearn that the ground beneath your feet and the water that moves through it are the beginning of everything. Everything else, the art, the administration, the religion, the architecture, the technology, the trade, the medicine, grows from that soil, watered by that river. In the same way that the emmer wheat grew and the date palms grew and the onions grew and all the countless unnamed plants that fed a civilization for 3,000 years grew patiently, persistently, returning every season to the same black silt, reaching for the same sun, nourished by the same ancient flood. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next one. If tonight's journey brought back memories of family meals, of food traditions passed down, of a grandmother's kitchen or a grandfather's garden, or the particular taste of something you haven't eaten in decades, I would be honored if you'd share them in the comments below. Your generation holds a kind of historical memory that doesn't live in books. The things you remember about how food was made, how it was preserved, how it connected families and seasons and occasions, those memories are irreplaceable, and the comment section is yours if you're inclined to leave them there. The ancient Egyptians understood that the dead should be provisioned with the best of what the living had. What you remember is the best of what remains. I'd be glad to hear it.